This is the Westminster Standard. I'm Ryan Beasy. Welcome, and I'm joined today by Dr. Miles Smith of Hillsdale College. Welcome. Thank you for joining the program.
Thank you, Ryan. Appreciate you having me.
Appreciate you taking time. So you are not a Presbyterian and not an elder, so it's a little bit different of a program. But would you give us your biography, your academic credentials? Because as we get into the conversation, I think
Yeah.
it'll become clear why we're having someone with your sort of expertise on the program.
Yeah. Well, I was a Presbyterian, so which maybe makes me even dirtier to some of your listeners.
You got a little bit of ashes
Yeah.
on your forehead there.
Yeah. So I'm a sort of a very Protestant Anglican. I was reared in the PCA. I'm not a Baptist turned Presbyterian. I was baptized as a Presbyterian. So 90% of my neighbors in rural North Carolina thought I was invalidly baptized, which is a source of inordinate pride to me. And so I was reared in Salisbury, North Carolina, which is about 45 minutes northeast of Charlotte. I went to the College of Charleston, and I sort of began to, I call my journey. I haven't really had too much of a journey. My switch to Anglicanism was not particularly interesting. I sort of went in any locale I went to, I sort of was wanting to go to the most serious and most ironic Protestant church. And so in North Carolina, where I was growing up, that was Presbyterianism is sort of the state church of the Protestants there. And in South Carolina, the state church was sort of conservative Anglicanism. And so I kind of found my way through geography into Anglican communions. And so I've sort of stayed there. My interests intellectually have always been, though, Southern Protestantism in the U.S. South. That was my geography. I was always fascinated by it. My dad was a ruling elder in the Presbyterian Church. My grandfather was. My great-grandfather was. My great-grandfather was. And there were a few Anglican vestrymen in there too. So I was just kind of curious about the story that led to, my own existence as a Presbyterian, and then later as an Anglican. So that was kind of my interest, and I sort of put it away for a long time because, like, I think anybody who's in the broader academic world, we're told that there's some things that aren't going to get you a job. And so I put that religious stuff away for a while, and I was very lucky. I ended up at my dream job. I have my dream job. It's the best college on the planet, Hillsdale College. And so I'm sort of able to have fun and sort of think more seriously about religion here. And I'm also able to do it, hopefully, in a way that lay people can find helpful and interesting, and to hopefully do that responsibly too. There's ways that's done irresponsibly these days, and so I kind of want to do it in a scholarly enough fashion, but also in a way that's accessible to lay people.
Well, thank you. And our topic today will involve Christianity, the nation. You've just recently published Religion and the Republic, as people might be able to see behind me. So we'll be talking about your response to a prospective overture for the PCA regarding Christian nationalism. So I thought we'd begin kind of like how they begin on Polity Matters, which is, of course, my favorite podcast. So let's begin with a game.
Okay.
And we don't have any fun music for this game, but I'm going to read a statement, and then I want you to tell me whether this was said by a Christian nationalist or an historic Protestant. So here we go. Here's number one. Kings and princes are commanded to kiss the Son of God. Not only are they enjoined to submit to his authority in their private capacity, but also to employ all the power that they possess in defending the church and maintaining godliness. So was that a Christian nationalist or an historic Protestant?
It's probably a historic Protestant.
You would be correct. That was said by John Calvin.
Yeah. There's a point in the Institutes where Calvin sort of says that the most noble profession is politics. He sort of says that that's the great profession, and it's right there in the Institute. So yeah, that sounded pretty much like Calvin. So
yes. All right. Well, let's we'll switch it up a little bit. No government can expect to prosper, which refuses to recognize religion, which deals with subjects as if they had no souls and cares not whether they serve God or Baal or no God at all. Such a government will find sooner or later that its line of policy is suicidal and damaging to its best interest. The kings of this world cannot make men Christians by laws and statutes, but they can encourage and support Christianity, and they will do so if they are wise. So, historic Protestant or Christian nationalist?
It's a historic Protestant, probably more 19th century than
Wha-
16th century, but that sounds like a historic Protestant rather than a sort of contemporary quote unquote Christian nationalist.
Well, you even got the century correct. That is Bishop J.C. Ryle, the evangelical bishop. I think was he the first bishop of Liverpool?
First Bishop of Liverpool. Yeah, very good.
So not an American, not even a Presbyterian. But I warrant that if one went to where he was preaching, you probably wouldn't be able to tell whether it was a PCA church or an Anglican church, except for whether it had air conditioning. Well, number 3, the people of this country being rational, moral, and religious beings, the government must be administered on the principles of reason, morality, and religion. By like necessity of right, the people being Christians and Protestants, the government must be administered according to the principles of Protestant Christianity. So, Christian nationalist or historic Protestant?
That's probably a historic Protestant too, rather than one of our contemporaries.
Yes, the syntax kind of gives it away, but that was Chuck Hodge from Princeton.
I was going to say it sounds like an American talking there, so they tend to you can kind of pick them out when they're writing. So
Yes, well, we can't fool the professional historian on the Westminster Standard. Thanks for playing. Getting into our main topic and games aside, when and where did this term Christian nationalism emerge? I think 5 years ago, I had never heard of a Christian nationalist. Where did this come from?
Well, I think it's really an imposition of telemedia, and so what happened is it was I think sort of mainlined and streamlined as a sort of slur against sort of any conservative Christian involvement in politics, and so it was something. And you see this some polemics by more progressive evangelicals or sort of historians and political writers who aren't sort of identifiably religious. They'll say, well, X is Christian nationalism. And so what happened is people see at least a sort of clique of Christians of varying different confessional backgrounds and very different actually approaches to this, whatever this thing Christian nationalism is. They kind of said, well, they're never going to like us anyway. Why don't we just take the term and make it our own? Why don't we sort of say, well, we're going to be Christian nationalists and we're going to be proud of it. So it's sort of taking what was used as a pejorative and sort of just disregarding the sort of anybody who might not have liked them in the first place. So you have to sort of have a certain approach to the public realm to even sort of take this title on. You have to have a certain indifference. You have to have a certain pugilistic approach to the interaction between religion and the modern zeitgeist to take this on. But I think that's what happened. People sort of got tired of being slandered, and so they said, well, why don't we just take the term? Why don't we just be proud of what you're calling us? And so this isn't the first time in history this happened, but that tends to be my kind of read on it. I wrote an article for Mere Orthodoxy a few years back that kind of touches on this. There's sort of everything that one group of people likes is Christian nationalism, and everything another group of people hates is Christian nationalism. And so, yeah, you sort of the term to me never ended up being particularly substantive. I never thought it was particularly helpful. I don't think it's describing a thing. I think it's sort of a catch-all that describes a lot of things, many of which are very different.
And always pejorative. As I tried to understand, any philosophy, it's helpful to have a name for it. And then, so, if I say to you as a historian, well, the fugitives or the agrarians would argue such and such, you would have a good idea of what I mean. But if I, from the pulpit, say, well, Christian nationalists would interpret this in such a way, well, I don't think that would be a meaningful way to speak to the people.
Yeah, I don't think
which Christian nationalists. What is a Christian nationalist?
The term's far too broad And so usually the people who are most interested in the term are the people either most unable or least willing to
Mm.
define it in a concise way.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a cause of significant confusion.
Yes, yes, and some of those quotes that we read from Hodge or Ryle, and I realize he's not an American, and there was an established church in his context, but today those might be interpreted as Christian nationalists. Oliver Cromwell might be interpreted as a Christian
Right.
nationalist.
Someone like Thomas Chalmers, who's
Yes,
quoted quite enthusiastically, is a more vigorous "quote unquote" Christian nationalism than either Ryle or Hodge would have been in the 19th century. So even Chalmers, who is commended in a well-known sermon by Tim Keller. I was just writing on this today. I've got a book coming out that will sort of deal with this, hopefully in the next year or so. I mean, Chalmers is by all measures a Christian nationalist, as we would define it today. Of course, he's also quoted enthusiastically by people who write for the Gospel Coalition. So I think it's a sort of a problematic term if we're going to label, if we're going to use it as broadly as we do.
yes, yeah. It seems it's too plastic. It means whatever I want it to mean,
Absolutely.
and whatever it's a straw man. I think.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it tends to be that way.
So, well, you asserted something on Twitter, and I have a nasty habit of inviting people who assert things on Twitter to come on the podcast and defend their assertions. But you said unsolicited advice to the PCA, and of course, you're a son of the PCA. You're a part of ACNA, and so one of our we have good fellowship with our Anglican brothers. So, and you're an expert in this field. So, unsolicited advice to PCA friends: the Christian Nationalism Study Committee will do you no good and probably end up pushing you further away from Protestant brethren in the Missouri Synod and the Anglicans, and make you more of an appendage of the Southern Baptist Convention, which is already a problem. Uh, and so I'll try to put on the screen there the resolution. But I want to begin with maybe the tail end or the appendage
Yeah.
of what you said. Is in what way is the PCA simply an appendage of the Southern Baptist Convention?
Yeah, well, sociologically, I think, and then again, I think a certain type of evangelical doesn't want to sort of talk about this because it sort of means we drop the sort of spiritual things that we care about and sort of have to talk about, I guess I'll call more worldly aspects. I mean, the PCA it grew in the 90s and the 2000s largely because it was adjacent to I would call folk Baptist communities in the South.
Hmm.
And so I think of the language that's often used to sort of bring people into the PCA, and well-meaning language. We here we have the gospel of grace, or something like that. And much of that language only works if, for example, you're largely adjacent to a certain type of fundamentalist or a certain type of Baptist. You're, I think, you were born Lutheran. Well, if you encounter a lot of Lutherans, especially serious Lutherans, I lived with Wisconsin Synod Lutheran, who's a dear friend. My boss is a Missouri Synod Lutheran. Lutherans would not grant that Calvinism is where the gospel of grace is. They would actually say, well, the gospel of grace is in the Lutheran church. We don't have as many rules as you Calvinists do. There's actually more strictures amongst Presbyterian circles. So in order to receive a certain polemic about Calvinist soteriology, you have to sort of be a certain sort of Baptist, a certain sort of folk Baptist. And so to the PCA's credit, it identified, I think, certain aspects of certain clericalist aspects of these churches. And so the PCA grew sort of by sort of gathering ex-Baptists to it. And so I think the numbers would bear out, right?
They do. They certainly do.
And so that's how the PCA grew. So what happened is I actually had a mini Twitter thread on this. What happened is people who were coming to the PCA were told they were coming for theological reasons. And perhaps that's true. But a lot of them were also coming with certain presumptions about the relationship between the church and politics from their sort of evangelical background. that they were expecting when they got to the PCA that the PCA wasn't doing. So I grew up Presbyterian in the ex-urban, or small town South, whatever you want to call it. My hometown's maybe 35,000 people. So not really a suburb. We're far enough out, so we're not really a suburb. If you would have gone into a lot of Presbyterian churches where I'm from, you would have found pretty right-wing people in the 1990s, unambiguously right-wing people. Those people were right-wing while also having a very capacious understanding of the spirituality of the church. So they were right-wing, but they didn't think they were right-wing because of church. For evangelicals and a certain type of folk Baptist, a certain type of folk evangelical, they do think that their politics are a creation of the church. And so as they went into PCA churches, guess what? They're escaping right-wing fundamentalism. And guess what? The expectation is, I'm not going to be exposed to right-wing people in a Presbyterian church because I understand that the church, the true church, isn't right-wing, right? It's bigger than that. And so they come with certain theopolitical expectations that aren't shared by a lot of what I call the sort of old school, spirituality of church, confessional Presbyterians. And so there's a confusion there. Evangelicals are by nature theopolitical. They don't have a framework of the spirituality of the church. Right? They don't have a space for that separation. They don't have a good disconnect for what is churchly and what is temporal, what is churchly and is political. And so for so many of them, they have what's really a theocratic expectation, even as they're mad at what they think of as theocracy.
And so that leads into
a good example is a guy like O. Palmer Robertson, who got up in front of GA, and I remember Dr. Robertson. I heard him preach. I grew up in his geography, and he's a missionary, and he's a pretty conservative guy when it comes to questions of what we might call sexuality. I don't think that anybody can call him a theocrat.
No.
Right. So someone might say, well, that guy sounds right wing when he's talking about, marriage and gender issues. And he's not using language that's sort of centrist evangelical language. He's using language that sounds like that kind of hard, almost biblicist language that people associate with fundamentalism. But he's not a biblicist fundamentalist at all.
No, he's an old school Presbyterian.
He's an old school Presbyterian. So
yes,
if you're coming into the PCA from certain sort of communions, I call them communions now, denominations, whatever the deuce somebody wants to call the blob that is kind of Baptist evangelicalism. If you're coming from sort of escaping fundamentalism, you have presumptions about what Presbyterian churchmanship is going to be that a lot of historic Presbyterians don't.
And we've seen that we sort of reaped the whirlwind there. I was texting with a friend who's a pastor in another state, and there were folks who wanted to give out this prayer guide at church leading up to the election. And he said, I just am not comfortable with this because some of them were pray that all of our members will vote, and that will help our members get to the polls, and that all Christians will vote in this election. And I don't know whether this is coming out before or after, but I was interviewing T. David Gordon, and he was saying, well, I'm not sure there is a Christian duty to vote. And so, my friend's concern was, well, how do we encourage people to pray that all Christians will vote if we can't point to a specific command that every Christian must vote? And what I told him to do, and this is coming back, is, well, O. Palmer Robertson has a prayer guide also for the election. If they want a prayer guide for the election, just point them to elder and recommend the prayer guide that Palmer Robertson has produced, which is largely based on Matthew Henry's method for prayer. So I think that's a great example that some of us believe the church is, as you say, theopolitical. So then, why do you think it would be problematic It sounds like there's a need for the
Yeah.
PCA to understand our political theology, our public theology better. Why do you think that such a study committee would push us away from our historic brethren?
Well, uh, you have two reasons. One, a lot of people who are Presbyterian. I mean, one of the things about Presbyterian, the PCA, as I experienced, is I don't think this is an unfair thing. You have a lot of people who are enthusiastic about Presbyterianism. Some of them are sort of like, cage stage confessional guys. Some of them are cage stage Keller guys. But Presbyterians tend to associate enthusiasm with leadership.
Huh.
Um, and so someone's enthusiastic, they're driven, they should be a leader.
Mm.
I don't want enthusiastic leaders. I
You
want,
want the leader with the biggest hat, as I
yeah,
understand.
yeah. I want slow, stupid, leadership. And so that's sort of a joke, but there's something to it as well. And so what's happened is you have a lot of people who are Presbyterian ruling elders and who are Presbyterian teaching elders that don't have enough sociological or historical seasoning to actually understand the taxonomies
Mm.
that would be necessary to make important divisions amongst the different tribes they think they're shadowboxing against. I think a good example is people who keep thinking, say, an author like Stephen Wolfe, people who think he's a theonomist. He's not a theonomist. Now, that doesn't mean you have to agree with him, but he's not a theonomist at all. And if you can't make that very basic distinction, you're shadowboxing against something that you don't actually understand, that you can't even define. And so
Mm.
I think of, for example, what is establishmentarianism? What is the spirituality of the church? All of these terms take deep study.
Yeah.
They take years of study to understand. I've been at it a long time. I still don't get it. I still have to read more and more and more. What this strikes me as is an impulse. There are people who see something politically they don't like. And so what they want is the church to weigh in and sort of exclude certain politics. Now, maybe those politics are distasteful. Maybe they are. Could be. I don't know. But is that the job of the church? So it sounds what they're actually wanting to do is they want the church to preclude certain political expressions, which is, by the way, a theocratic proposition. And
So,
and and so you're wanting theocracy to go to war against theocracy,
hmm.
essentially. And so I just don't know if there's enough people, enough scholars out there. There's a few, guys who are PCA academics who I think would be fantastic. And if I could pick it, I would, by the way, probably be less theopolitical than even some guys who are in good standing. I'm a pretty ferocious two kingdoms guy. I don't much like the church doing any politics.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I'm uncomfortable with voter guides. Maybe there's a good case of it. It's just my disposition is I don't like. So I would probably end up, I think someone, who can sort of make those distinctions wouldn't necessarily arrive at my position, or maybe they would. I don't know. But I just think there's a sort of a dearth of erudition on what the actual terms are. And so I don't know if people are actually able to draw the lines that would be necessary to do this in such a way that they actually understand what is churchly and what is political.
Hmm. And I wonder, I'm not convinced this study committee is a bad idea. I'm not. I mean, I actually contemplated bringing a similar overture to my own presbytery. I'm not convinced it's a good idea. But something that you said resonated with me. I wonder if it's people want an ex cathedra statement from General Assembly that this is bad. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But wouldn't, as we talked about earlier, the first thing they're going to have to do is define the thing that they're
Right.
supposed to be studying, and to distinguish Christian nationalism from that Reconstructionism, which is easy to do in 2 minutes, but not easy to do in 2,000 words. And of course,
Yeah.
these study committees will be much longer than 2,000 words. But the more you say, the harder it is to distinguish the two to a point.
I think the other aspect of this is, of course, the if you think that the church is competent enough to enact political exclusions on the laity, why aren't you Catholics? I think that's a fair question. Um, and so, if the church is competent enough to do politics, then why are people worried about theonomic reconstructionism? Um, I don't think the church is competent to do politics. I think the church is competent to worship in word and sacrament.
Mm.
Um, and so I think that it strikes me as there's a bit of confusion here going on here, because you have a lot of people who I think want what you just said, sort of a Presbyterian version of an ex cathedra statement about the political life of the laity, and what they can and cannot read. And I'm just not sure the church is competent to do that. Um, and this is not a fight that's limited to Presbyterians, by the way. Anglicans have this conversation as well.
Yes, yeah, yes, and I wondered, is there a serious problem with? I'm going to use a term that has no meaning here. Christian nationalism. Is there a serious problem with Christian nationalism in the PCA? I've heard from missionaries that it's more of a problem in Europe, as guys are dealing with some Moscow influenced people in Europe. But I don't know how much of a problem it is, and that we got 100 problems in the PCA. Is this one of the top 10 that we need to deal with at General Assembly? I'm not so sure. Here's some of the background that the PCA adopted the American revisions to the Westminster Confession of Faith, and so it changed explicitly the relationship between the magistrate and the church. And I remember in a discussion that you had on Presbycast, there was some disagreement or misunderstanding whether a person who agreed with the original Westminster Confession would need to state a difference with the new. And I don't think he would, because I don't think the American version necessarily excludes what was changed. Just like the American version doesn't state that the Bishop of Rome is the Antichrist.
Right.
But I don't think that someone who believes that the Bishop of Rome is the Antichrist, like most of the men in 1788 did, would need to state a difference. They just said, we don't need this in our confessional document. We're not going to make this a point of contention.
Yeah, I think that too. A guy who I really trust on this stuff, and who is I think an absolute gem of a Presbyterian pastor scholar, is Reverend Dr. Scott Swaim.
Mm.
At RTS Orlando, who I think has recently, I saw something he put on social media, who really gets at sort of what the tensions actually are. And so he is, I think, a Presbyterian voice who's deeply trustworthy on this. So if a study committee were to happen, he'd be, I think, a guy they should look seriously at, because I think he's just able to make appropriate distinctions. One of the things that I've been asked this by students, and my joke is that there's much that's changed by the confession revisions of 1788, and I jokingly tell students it's a little much, but it's not a lot of much. And so I think that, as my joke is actually getting at, that the substantive changes don't revolutionize the relationship between the church, the laity, and the civil order.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's overstated. And I try to make that point in my book a little bit. I don't think there's a sort of socio-ecclesial revolution that goes with the American Revolution. And so I just don't see that. And I don't think that bears out. I mean, Bernard Bailyn, who's a luminary in the field of colonial history and the early republic, says as much in his own work. And Bailyn has Pulitzer Prizes. I'm not as important as he is, but I think that he's onto something here. That there's not this kind of en masse revolution that happens in churches. Really, it's a very specific ecclesial preclusion. It is not revolutionizing the relationship, even per se, between the civic order, politics, and the church. It's an exclusion, but it's a little much of an exclusion. I'm not sure it's a lot of much of an exclusion.
Well, and this has been pointed out before, it's one of the differences that I would state when I come into a presbytery, that the larger catechism, when our forefathers revised the standards. They didn't change the larger catechism in the Lord's Prayer that the civil magistrate is to maintain the church. So what does that mean? Was that an oversight? And some people believe they just, they missed it. I think the men in the late 18th century were smarter than that.
Yeah, I think some of the tension comes from the idea of separate. So there's a certain reading of the spirituality of the church that pairs spirituality of the church with a specific idea of separation, and it's the idea that the church is sort of a heavenly society here on earth. Anglicans don't. Anglicans actually have a doctrine that's similar to the spirituality of the church. We typically call it the independence of the church, and I actually like that a little bit better because the people aren't merely spirits.
Right.
You're embodied. You're actually, bad news, you're not a heavenly society floating above earth. You're a heavenly society that's actually on earth. You are people
in the muck of it, right?
Yeah, you interact with the political order. And by political order, I don't mean American electoral order. I mean human association,
yes.
Right? The type of stuff that Aristotle talks about. And so you actually have to interact with what is properly political. Mm-hmm. What is important, what I think the value of a healthy ring of spirituality of the church says, okay, yes, we are formed from that, but what we do is something that, so we don't do politics. We are political while not doing politics, if I can make that distinction. So I think that's what a healthy version of that looks like.
Yes, and I think you bring a lot of this out in your book. Other historic confessional Protestant communions have viewed a much more have had a much more nuanced view of the state. In your book, you say that until about 1865, the church was, of course, disestablished, but not disentangled with society. Can you expound on that? And hopefully people will buy your book.
Yeah. So I think that, before, historically, for example, Protestants on the continent don't have something like civil marriage. Calvin introduces civil marriage. So the question is, Calvin's one of the first people to introduce civil marriage. So is marriage a religious act or a political one?
Yes.
Is it a churchly act or is it a political act?
Yes, I mean, when I was a younger minister, I would have trouble saying, "By the power vested in me by the state of Mississippi, I now declare you husband and wife." But because, no, it's God who declares you husband. Well, actually, it's God through the state recognizes this. It is lawful for all sorts of people to marry. So there is a civil interest in that.
Yeah, and so Ryan, you might know this. What group of Christians have fought most ferociously against civil marriage? It's Roman Catholics.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
And so, of course,
it's a sacrament.
Because it's a sacrament. It's a religious act. It's exclusively a religious act. And the state really has no bearing on it one way or the other. Protestant, especially Calvinist Protestants, have always affirmed civil marriage over and against their Lutheran and Anglican brethren. Civil marriage isn't introduced in England until the 1830s, for example. Lutherans have always had a space for civil marriage, but not to the extent that Calvinists did. So again, this presents a little bit of a problem for the idea that the church is this kind of entirely disconnected sort of spiritual force, because obviously there's provisions for marriage in churches. Baptism is another example. Baptism is the way you enter into the churchly community. And obviously, the Presbyterians and Anglicans both view that as a sacrament. Well, what else are you doing when you baptize a baby? You're making him a part of a visible community, not merely the visible church, but now he's added to something called a family. Right. And so like these sorts of lines, we desperately want there to sort of be these lines that we can kind of disentangle ourselves from that which is what we call political. The problem is that ends up disentangling the church from that which is human, which is not good. The church is still human. right? If you find a church that's not human, let me know. I'm sure it won't have any of the problems that other churches have, but the church is human. So it's spiritual and it's made up of people. People aren't merely spirits. And so this is something that I think that hasn't been thought out very well. There's a tendency to sort of accept sort of biblicist answers that sort of proof text us into this kind of spiritualized idea of the church, but the church isn't merely spiritual. It does spiritual things, but it's not merely spiritual.
Hmm.
So the fact that the church is charged with doing spiritual things doesn't mean that its body is merely spiritual.
And of course, the first controversy of the um, New Covenant Church was over certain widows not getting food,
Right.
and that's at least why Presbyterians have deacons. I'm not sure if that's why
Yeah,
Anglicans have
which
deacons.
isn't a sacramental controversy, right?
Right,
It's one that deals with right
very
human
human concern. We
associations.
are hungry.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, I think there's a lot going on here, and I think that we have to sort of get away from sort of short answers and what I call sort of proof texted answers. That's not necessarily saying that we can't look to the scriptures as authoritative on this. I typically am hesitant to look to the Bible for politics,
Hmm.
um, because I don't think of the Bible as doing politics. I think the Bible is really about Jesus, and so I'm probably hesitant to look at the Bible for quote unquote kingdom politics, which is kind of a fancy centrist name for theocracy. Um, and so that's my hesitation there. I don't think that annihilates the fact that there are biblical precepts that weigh on politics, though.
Absolutely. That the church doesn't preach politics, but it does preach principles.
Right. That's right.
I remember when I was in Mississippi, and there was an amendment regarding, I think it was a personhood amendment. This was in the early 2010s, and there were some people some PCA churches actually that were taking signatures after worship in the narthex to try to get this on the ballot, and there were other very conservative, very confessional PCA churches that the pastors said we will have nothing to do with that, and it wasn't because they were pro abortion. It was because we're the church.
Hmm.
It's not on the
Yeah.
Lord's day. It's not our business to be taking up petitions, and that was something. Going back to what you said earlier, that a lot of the Baptists and even papists involved in getting this on the ballot, they just didn't understand. But
Yeah.
as you Anglicans will say, well, the church is independent of that.
Right.
And
It's
then,
we're independent, and so I think that there's something about the Presbyterian version, the rightly ordered understandings of spirituality of the church that can sort of find that line. I think a figure like Charles Hodge thinks he's doing it. Alan Strange's new book, I think, touches on this. Alan probably puts a little bit more space between Thornwell and Hodge than I would. I think that Thornwell strikes me as more consistent, perhaps, than Hodge does. But they're both valuable thinkers who are sort of asking questions about the spirituality of the church, what that means, and what the relationship between politics and the ecclesial body look like.
and it's interesting, Thornwell and then Stuart Robinson, another champion of the spirituality of the church. Stuart Robinson, I believe he was on the city council or the county
Yeah.
board. He was. These men were very much involved in political activities. Thornwell, prior to his untimely death in 1862, was advocating for a preamble to the national constitution of the nation that we won't mention, but that actually acknowledged that the people of that nation, which we won't mention, we're under the lordship of Christ, right? We
Yeah.
acknowledge our responsibility to God and the supremacy of his son, Jesus, as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And he wanted that added to that nation's constitution.
I think
Then,
this is it's a great question, because obviously the question is not whether, I think for a lot of people say, well, is that the church doing, or is that the state doing churchly stuff?
right.
No, I don't think it's the state doing churchly stuff. It is the state doing something religious, though, and I think
Hmm.
we need to distinguish that. And so, really, the question is, can the state do that? Can the state do a religious act? Um, the Constitution of modern Ireland, for example, it's consecrated to the Trinity. Um,
Mm.
does that make the state of Ireland, the Irish state, does that make it a church? I don't think so.
Yeah.
And so I think these are actually the questions, getting away from these are the more substantive questions to ask. What we're really asking is, can a non-churchly institution do something that's religious? Is religious capacious enough to include things that aren't immediately churchly? I think this is the argument. And that's
Yeah.
what I try to get at the book. I think there are institutions that do religious things that aren't immediately churches. I think a Christian school is doing Christian things. I think a Christian family is doing Christian things. I don't think that means they're churches.
Right, and that's such an important distinction that you make. That, even if we go to Kuyper, again, not a Presbyterian, well, sort of a Presbyterian, but not an American at least, and the spheres of the family, the church, and the state, and the family can be Christian. The church is obviously Christian. Well, in what sense then could the state be Christian? And if the state is made up of people who are religious, just as they are political, does not the state have some religious interest? And of course, Thornwell and many others in the 19th century, Hodge and Ryle, as we discussed earlier, would say yes. But of course, Peck, Thomas Peck, the student of James Henley Thornwell and Dabney's successor at Union, says, this doesn't make any sense. What are we saying when we're saying all of this about Christ? Is this document Christian? What about the people? So it gets, well, it gets complicated,
Yeah,
doesn't it?
it does. And I think that really the change happens around the turn of the 20th century. I think that's when most substantive changes happen on this stuff. So I think that's really where the conversation is necessary. The scholarly conversation should probably
Yes.
focus on. You mentioned Peck, who's a great example of someone who's pretty different on these questions than his teachers and his predecessors.
Hmm. And so before we round that corner, can you just give just a brief overview of how the Christians in prior to 1865 or so, and even continuing, of course, to the end of the century, but would have incorporated these Christian principles into the state without making the state churchly or making the state subservient to the church? What did that look like, as you talk about in your book?
So there's two things that happen. Really, a difference in what the national state was changes. They didn't view they're not really committed nationalist as we understand. This is the reason why I couldn't call myself a Christian nationalist. I don't believe that there's this kind of unitary organic nation like a la Hegel that's out there that kind of has a will that can be Christian. So the term I use in the book is Christian institutionalism. I do think that institutions can have Christian commitments.
Yes.
And so I think what that looks like in the early republic is those institutions having a sort of fraternal relationship with the state. I use the example of colleges. The state colleges are more or less kind of Christian.
Yes. Yes.
And they're state supported. They're funded by the people. And so they're these state sort of sustained and state kind of state approved institutions that have Christian commitments. Chaplains are another example. The American Diplomatic Corps acts in that way. Missionaries are sort of agents of the state while also being devoted to Christianity. So what you have is sort of a more fraternal, a more kind of brotherly relationship between government and a bunch of other institutions. There's an understanding that the state is not the only way you govern society. Family, schools, hospital, all these things are governing their own little spheres. What happens after the Civil War, and especially in the 20th century, is the state comes to sort of step in and claim all of these other intermediary institutions as its own. So the state takes over instead of outsourcing sort of aspects of human governance to missionaries, or outsourcing it to universities, or outsourcing it to the states themselves, the state legislatures. The big national government comes and begins to claim everything. So I think that change affects how religion interacts with the state. And so it makes it so that anything that ends up being sort of religious that touches the government has to be run through the federal government.
Mm.
And so, and that's the scholarship on that is pretty clear. I mean, Abraham Lincoln is a committed nationalist, for better or worse. So I think it's probably one of those things where we would people who are sort of maybe centrist evangelicals who want to claim the legacy of Abraham Lincoln need to deal with the fact that he's a pretty committed nationalist who's pretty okay with that nation doing things that look pretty religious. And so I'm not as enthused about that. And I think that's just an intellectually honest opinion. So I don't think you can, for example, claim the mantle of Christian abolitionism and then turn around and be really angry about the fact that they are pretty committed to a national framework for politics and pretty committed to a Christianized national framework for politics. So you can't like the abolitionists and then turn around and sort of say, "Oh, I hate the idea of a nationally Christian politics," because that's what they wanted.
Mm-hmm. And it's that period, after 1865, and then of course the New Deal, were major expansions of federal power, where everything now runs through the federal government. You can't have a local police department that's not driving a tank that was given
Right.
to them by the Department of Defense, and it's
Yeah.
just why on earth is the federal government so big?
And believe it or not,
And
the New Deal is predicated on a considerable amount of Christian language.
yes,
Yeah, the
as with the
fireside chats are kind of Christian.
yes.
So again, I think it's sort of like I think there's a type of person who wants to sort of have a bunch of stuff that they think of as sort of secular when it's actually largely, done on the back of Christian rhetoric.
Hmm. And even a lot of the Green New Deal, or was it the Inflation Reduction Act? I
Yeah.
can't remember. But what is predicated upon Christian, or at least spiritual ideas, religious language, and we do hear that. We're still hearing that. If this comes out before the election is over, remember the 5th of November, I suppose.
Was that election day this year? Okay.
I either that or they're blowing up Parliament. I can't remember which one. You as an Anglican will get that joke.
Yeah, we still there's still a black letter day in the prayer book for November 5th, actually. So
Wow, yeah, yes, would have certainly changed the course of world history. But so American Protestants maintain these Christian precepts in their social, their political institutions, recognizing that these aren't religious institutions, and yet the people are religious. And so I've wondered, is this just a matter of something being church run versus Christian run? Those
yeah,
distinctions that we don't seem to have a lot of the nuance for today, which of course the Reformed used to.
so it comes from when our understanding of the word secular is very different than the historic understanding of the word secular. To something that was secular historically was something, it just meant it's not churchly. So, for example, I'm considered a secular officer in the Anglican Church.
Hmm.
So I oversee the church. I'm a vestryman. So I oversee the church's secular affairs. It means
So it'd be the corporation.
the building. Yeah, that's right. The building. Does the air conditioning work? We got a plan for XXX. So vestry, we're not overseeing the sacramental affairs of the church. That's the job of the bishop and the rector.
Hmm.
And so those are classically understood to be secular affairs, which is why lay people oversee it. And
so would that be akin to, excuse me for interrupting, would that be akin to the deacon in a Presbyterian church?
like a Presbyterian deacon.
Who would be ordained?
Yeah, and so there's of course this interesting thing, because deacons in the Anglican context are considerably different than Roman Catholic deacons or Presbyterian deacons. All three are ordained. Deacons are in holy orders, as we would understand it. So we would address them as reverend. But what they do is they oversee a certain churchly function, which is given in the New Testament in the Acts to oversee, for example, widows, the poor, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a sort of, I call it theopolitical aspect of the church, and deacons oversee that. Um, that is a religious vocation.
I see.
Oversee
Okay.
the poor is a religious vocation. To worry about the building is not seen as a religious vocation.
Okay, so I see that's more trustee then,
Yes,
as
yes.
in
So
the Presbyterian Church. Okay, thank you for translating to
yeah, there's
for
a distinction, but of course, PCA diaconates typically oversee
the air
the
conditioning.
yeah. So there aren't many trustees around in Presbyterian churches today, although that's something that historically was, especially in Southern churches, you would find that. So
Yes, we recently rewrote our bylaws and elected trustees and revived the board of trustees. I think that's what it's called, or maybe it's the corporate board. You would think I would know. Um, so Americans historically believed, as I understand from your book, that Protestantism is essential to liberty,
yeah,
and
they
and
think
and
they get
even
their
oh, I'm
liberty
sorry.
they think they get their liberty from a certain reading of English political history, and they would have understood that to be explicitly Protestant. Right? No one thinks they're getting their political liberties from James II.
Yes, no, not yeah. They kicked him out, didn't they? Yeah, in the Glorious Revolution. So, if historically Americans have believed that Protestantism is crucial to our liberties, and I know this isn't your area of expertise, but current events would seem to bear that out. Current events being not your expertise, as opposed to his story where you've got your PhD from. When historically did this become controversial? You said around the turn of the 20th century.
Yeah, I think, or even later. I mean, one of the things I think is I'm more convinced now, and I haven't written on this yet. But I'm more convinced now. A lot of the change occurs with the advent of the Warren Court in the 1950s
Hmm.
and 60s.
Which is when they took the prayer out of schools.
Yeah, in sort of that era, um, Eisenhower sort of brings a form of religion back in to fight communism, but actually sort of churchly religion, institutional religion, has a lot of the teeth taken out of it
Yeah.
um, in the era. So, for example, I mean, even the question, like I've heard people say, well, you really shouldn't. They shouldn't be reading the Bible at schools anyway because they might get it wrong or something like that. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Flesh that out because that's one of my concerns. As with prayer, that well,
yeah,
I'm not sure I want the government teacher
yeah.
instructing my child in prayer and the Bible. I think Machen makes a
Well,
similar point.
yeah. So I think that the problem is like, okay, um, what do you want the government school to do instead? Do you want
Hmm.
them to treat to denude schools of that which is religious? Um, and everyone will say, "Yeah, I don't want the church. I don't want the school doing prayer." No, no, no. What you mean is you want the schools to be not doing things that are churchly. You don't want religion taken out of the schools because religion is much more capacious in some ways than that which is religious is more capacious than that which is churchly. And so if so the question is, do you only think that a church can pray? Can only Christians pray? For example, and these are right, theological issues above my pay grade, but they speak to kind of our understanding, um, uh, you know, of all of this. And so what I think is when people sort of say, "Well, I don't want the people reading the Bible," what they mean is you don't want people doing theology.
Hmm.
You're actually fine with people reading the Bible, and you should be fine with people reading the Bible because the Western world was built on people reading, right, sort of biblical moral precepts. So, right, you're going to get your moral precepts somewhere, and I think the Bible is a pretty good place to get them. Does that mean I'm doing church when I teach? You're a fourth grader, a moral lesson from the Bible? No. But too many people reflexively think this is churchly.
Yeah.
So again, we have a lot of confusion that our 19th century forebears didn't have on this.
So I remember when I was in Mississippi pastoring, the the retired chancery clerk was a member of our congregation, and from time to time, he would call and say, they need somebody to open the court in prayer. Can you do it on Monday next week? Oh yeah, sure. And I would go and I would pray in the name of Jesus, referencing the Trinity. A number of times I was invited by our state senator to open the state Senate in prayer, which I know they do even in the one in DC. But these were, and our city council here in Georgia, they'll open their meetings with a ostensibly Christian prayer, which is what has been done in this republic since, and probably even before the republic, going back to the colonial days. Those, the colonial councils probably opened in prayer. So that's not anything new, yet it's become controversial.
Yeah, it's because I think this is probably what we need to sort of realize. The state is now claiming to do theology. So we're worried about the church doing politics a lot. What we don't talk quite as much about, and I think we should, is the extent to which our government is far more theocratic than we tend to think.
Oh,
right. It has a God.
Mm-hmm.
Carl Truman's very good on this. Andrew Walker at Southern Seminary is quite good. Robert George at Princeton is good on this, right? A Presbyterian, a Baptist, and a Roman Catholic, all sort of are good. Quick to note that, and Carl Truman will be here tomorrow at Hillsdale. I'm thrilled that he's speaking here. Right, our government has metaphysical commitments, whether it calls those metaphysical commitments or not. So your government is going to do religion, whether it calls it religion or not. There's a great writer named Joseph Pieper, who wrote a book called Leisure is the Basis of Culture. And he calls culture essentially what everybody in the society is willing to sacrifice to. Every society has something like that. Every society has a cultus, a cult. Our government has a cult. The 19th century American government had a cult. The British Empire had a cult. Genghis Khan had a cult. Every one of these has something they do that's essentially
it's civic religion.
Yeah, there's never, we call it civic religion, but once you use Pieper's language, you realize there's no getting away from it.
Right. Civic religion isn't necessarily bad.
No,
it's when that's all that it is the problem.
Yeah. So what we're mad about is our government has sort of taken theology as a prerogative, and it's taken those things away from the church. Our government rules churches in a way that historically governments haven't. For example, our government is far more theocratic than the 19th century government of Great Britain, which was legally a theocracy. Why? Because Parliament does occasionally tell the church to do something, and the church gets mad about it. Our government tells churches to do something, and we don't have the capacity to get mad at it the same way the Church of England does. Why? Because there's nobody who is officially a recognized voice to be griped at by. So again, that's not a bad thing. I actually like the fact that we're completely a disestablished church, but with disestablishment means you probably have to guard against the government doing theology as much as you do the church doing politics.
Indeed. I want to put up a quote here from J. Gresham Machen and see if you can help us to understand where this would fit in all of this discussion. When, for example, the great and glorious promises of the Bible to redeem children of God are read as if they belong to the right of man as man, have we not an attack on the very heart of the Bible's teaching? What could be more terrible, for example, from the Christian point of view, than the reading of the Lord's Prayer to non-Christian children, as though they could use it without becoming Christians, as though the persons who have never been purchased by the blood of Christ could possibly say to God, "Our Father, which art in heaven." So Machen, obviously, as you see there, the necessity of the Christian school, arguing against using the Lord's Prayer in school, which I think was customary, that begin the day with the Lord's Prayer in even government schools. But would this be an example of the government doing something churchly, using the Lord's Prayer, as opposed to simply a prayer that is more of a mere invocation?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the custom of at least the American state was not to use the Lord's Prayer in the 19th century. I've got some stuff on that. I'm looking forward to writing up. They don't really use the Lord's Prayer.
Hmm.
Um, uh, Almost all the invocations are done by clerics, and are unless they're sort of reading from a prayer book, short and simple, and basically invoking God as sovereign,
Mm-hmm.
not invoking God as Redeemer. They're not necessarily
So
doing.
keeping the two kingdoms separate.
Yeah,
Even.
yeah, they're actually relatively fair. Almost a bunch of the guys who sound like Christian nationalists in the 19th century are pretty ferocious disestablishmentarians.
Hmm.
Um, and so, like, they have a space that we don't. So, for example, I think the Lord's Prayer example is useful. I think the better example is be like, well, you're not going to give communion, right? To everyone. Well, of course, you're not going to give communion. And so I typically think that prayer isn't a clerical act, though. I don't know how much control the church should have over prayer, because your children pray, right? Are you? Does the pastor have, especially Presbyterians? They care a lot about conscience, right? Right. I mean,
Sometimes.
right. Yeah. Sometimes. So I mean, like, is prayer a clerical act? Does it have to be done by a pastor? And so if it can be done by someone who's not a pastor, that means we have to ask about the way in which it's a strictly churchly act.
Yes.
And if it's not a strictly churchly act, we have to ask who else can do it. And so I think this is one of the things where I probably break with Gresham Machen on this. And the other thing too is I think that PCAers, I mean, I like Gresham Machen. If you only can find one guy you like historically, that's a cult. That's not a denomination. And so, right, like there's other people who are conservative Presbyterians who are thinking about these things. I think Gresham Machen saw what was happening in the Presbyterian Church and was understandably completely worried.
Yeah. Oh, yes. And here he may be responding to
Yeah.
a situation in which the nation is to his predecessor at Princeton, to Dr. Hodge, that the nation no longer is really Protestant by
Right.
the 1920s and 30s. It's
I mean,
something else. Liberalism has taken over.
yeah, the liberalism, and so the liberalism in the churches obviously feeds the state, and vice versa. So again, these things are disestablished, but they're never completely separate. They actually inform each other. And so I think, again, I don't know the answer to this. I'm not an ordained person, but I think the question becomes figuring out what is churchly, what is not churchly, what must be done by a cleric. I, for example, there are things that I think only my priest can do. And there's certain things, for example, I think I mean, even in Presbyterians, there's a debate over this in a way. The PCA is a 2-office church.
Sure. Yeah.
Which means
we say that.
Yeah. Which means canonically that a ruling elder could potentially do the pastoral prayer. And so, like, this is a debate.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And
What does it mean to be 2-office when
Yeah.
there are clearly things that teaching elders only can do, whereas
Right.
ruling elders are not. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, like, even this, we have debates over what is churchly, even within churchly actors, right? What can a pastor do? What can a ruling elder do? For us, it's a little bit different because of the Anglican structure. There are some things that deacons can do, but obviously, something that priests can do that deacons can do. So these questions are all around us. I think that they're actually worth asking because it gets to the questions of something like Christian nationalism. What can a church do? What can a nation do? Those are more useful thinking through rather than sort of basing the engagement on these ideas with political outcomes that someone may or may not like.
Right. And I think that you've given us again some added nuance about we need to ask. We need to recognize that no one is not religious.
Right.
that I think it was Ike Reeder on a previous episode made the point that you're not choosing between a Christian college and a non-religious college. You are always sending your son or daughter to a religious college. Will it be Christian or will it be some other religion? And likewise with the state, it is always going to be religious, just as the church will always be political in a sense, because we're dealing with people who are members of the polis, and we need to try to have a better understanding of what sort of religious expression must the state unavoidably express.
Yeah, what is churchly, what isn't? Yeah, all important questions. So I'm sure you'll figure it out, Ryan. So yeah, you're the one guy we can kind of count on here.
Well, as has often been said on the Westminster Standard, I don't think there will be another conversation on this topic. I think we've settled it, and if we haven't, there may be $10,000 available to the General Assembly to settle this issue ex cathedra once and for all. So, Dr. Miles Smith, thank you so much for sharing your time and offering some helpful concerns and giving us even some vocabulary to discuss this.
Thank you, Ryan, and thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. Thanks for joining the conversation on the Westminster Standard, which is the podcast of Jude 3. Please visit our website, jude3pca.org. We're so thankful to those of you who have been able to assist us in our work of producing this podcast and encouraging old school confessional Reformed Presbyterianism within the PCA. Come back again next week for a conversation with Zach Garris, Zach Groff, and Professor Ben Dunson on the role of women in the church. I'll talk to you then.